It begins, as many peculiar ideas do, in the dry heat of ancient Greece among papyrus scrolls, olive trees, and learned men trying to make sense of what they could not see. Blood flowed where it ought not. Voices shook with emotion for reasons unclear. And sometimes, women fainted, gasped, or convulsed without warning. The conclusion they came to, strange as it may sound to modern ears, was that the womb had a mind of its own. To the philosophers and physicians of classical antiquity, the female body was a mystery wrapped in suspicion. The uterus, they believed, was a creature, a restless, wandering thing. The earliest references to this notion come from the Corpus Hippocraticum, a collection of medical writings attributed to him, though compiled by various authors over time. In these early Greek medical texts, the female body was considered a delicate balance of wet and dry, hot and cold. If it wasn't regularly satisfied through intercourse and pregnancy, it might grow restless, deprived of its natural function. It would begin to wander through the body in search of moisture or release, compressing organs, pressing against the lungs, or obstructing the throat. In some cases, intercourse itself was recommended not out of cruelty, but from the belief that the womb needed semen to remain healthy and content. Women, thought to be moister and colder than men, were therefore more prone to imbalance. And when the balance tipped, the womb responded not passively, but actively. Even Plato, in his dialogue, described the womb as a living creature within another living creature, prone to hysteria when unsatisfied. There were no MRAs, no neurological diagnoses, and no biochemical studies of hormones. There were only observable behaviors and physical symptoms. Men, whose bodies were considered balanced, rational, and complete, suffered from illnesses of logic and excess. Women, meanwhile, were dominated by their reproductive organ scene not as full persons, but as vessels with tempers. They couldn't vote, they couldn't hold office, and they couldn't counter a physician's claim about their wandering womb with medical reasoning of their own. Their experiences, whether trauma, grief, or confusion, were filtered through the vocabulary of male-dominated medicine, and in that world, anxiety had no name, only hysteria did. Even today, how often are women's emotional struggles dismissed as hormonal, dramatic, or overreactions? And when women wept, screamed, fainted, or trembled when they suffered grief to openly or anger to fiercely ancient, physicians reached for the tools they had. And what they had, above all, was the belief that the womb ruled the woman. That in the absence of modern science, they reached into the darkness of the human mind and body and pulled out metaphors, monsters, and moving organs. Their explanations, however flawed, were attempts to explain why some people suffered in ways invisible to others. Her uterus was acting out, and she was merely the host. It was, he said, an animal that longs to generate children. If a woman began to show these signs, it was said that her womb had floated upward, choking her from within. She wasn't simply upset or unwell, she was hysteric. The Greek term from which hysteria would eventually derive. According to these texts, the womb could become discontent. This wasn't a metaphor. This was medical doctrine. A woman with signs of wandering womb might be told to rest in a cool room, to bathe, to inhale certain herbs, or to eat particular foods. The problem wasn't her fault, it was her biology. In some cases, this meant she was relieved from domestic duties or social expectations, given time and space to heal. But in others, it meant forced sexual encounters, experimental remedies, or spiritual interventions, symptoms of what we might now recognize as anxiety, panic attacks, or seizure tightness in the chest, shortness of breath, paralysis, or fits were attributed to the womb's misbehavior. The treatments were as unsettling as the diagnosis. Doctors attempted to lure the womb back to its proper place through scent therapy. Sweet-smelling substances like rose oil or myrrh were applied to the vaginal area to coax the womb downward. Simultaneously, foul odors such as burnt hair or smoke were administered near the woman's nose or mouth, driving the rogue organ away from the lungs and back to the pelvis. It was essentially a push and pull system, using perfumes and putrid smoke to herd the uterus like a stubborn goat. If that didn't work, more physical methods were employed. Hot compresses, vibrating tools, even manual manipulation by midwives or healers. The underlying assumption in all this was clear. The female body was built for reproduction, and when it didn't fulfill that purpose, it revolted. These ideas weren't fringe. They endured through centuries and shaped the way women's emotions and health were understood. In this context, a woman's distress was not emotional or spiritual, it was anatomical. But behind this bizarre logic lay something deeper and more revealing. A medical system that lacked tools to explain the invisible. This belief gave rise to a profound gender divide in ancient medicine. It's worth noting that this wasn't always cruel. In fact, many treatments were rooted in care. In Athens, women had no formal voice in public life, so the womb kept wandering. And so did the stories. What is perhaps most fascinating is not that the Greeks misunderstood anxiety, but that they tried earnestly to understand it. And though the language they used has long been replaced, the echoes remain. Is it really so different from believing their organs are misbehaving? And if so, what does that say about how far we've truly come? The image of a womb drifting through the body may seem surreal, almost absurd to modern sensibilities. But in ancient Greece and the Roman world that followed, it was not just a theory. It became a foundational principle of female medicine. Galen expanded on Hippocratic teachings and helped codify the idea emotional disturbances in women were rooted in uterine pathology. But Galen was no fool. His writings were dense with anatomical observation and surgical speculation. Women would fall to the floor, their eyes rolling back, their breathing labored, as if seized by invisible hands. Modern diagnoses might label this epilepsy, conversion disorder, or panic attacks. But to Galen, the culprit was internal. The womb had misbehaved again. He performed animal dissections and believed that understanding the body meant observing its physical form. As centuries passed, this idea didn't vanish. It evolved. By the time of Galen, the famed Roman physician in the 2nd century CE, the concept of hysteria had become even more systematized. A woman suffering from what we might now call generalized anxiety might be subjected to. Even so, he still maintained that the uterus could be the source of suffocation, convulsions, and fainting fits. In both Greek and Roman culture, the boundary between medicine and religion was porous. A woman's womb could be appeased not just with scents or massages, but with divine favor. Was her anxiety spiritual, physical, or perhaps both? Virginity was considered dangerous, not for moral reasons alone, but because an unoccupied womb could become wild. A wandering womb wasn't just folklore, it was justification for controlling women's sexuality, mobility, and emotional expression. A woman grieving the loss of a child, her womb must be in turmoil. A young woman afraid to marry, her uterus must be congested with pent-up fluids. An older widow with panic attacks or melancholy, her womb had turned against her, starved of its natural role. In a society where men held power, this diagnosis doubled as a prescription for obedience. Physicians treated the body, but healers, midwives, and priests also played roles in health. Shrines to gods like Asclepius, the Greek god of healing, were destinations for the unwell, especially women. These women, often dismissed by scholars of the time, passed down herbal remedies, massage technique, and gynecological practices from generation to generation. The uterus was almost universally seen as a powerful organ, creative, yes, but also volatile. They worked with the body, not against it. They recognized emotional pain for what it was, even if they lacked the vocabulary of psychology. And when that power wasn't used, it was feared. A non-maternal womb was not just inactive, it was dangerous. And though their methods were sometimes unscientific, they were often rooted in empathy and Quran antidote to the cold logic of academic theory. The theory of the wandering womb would be replaced by newer terms, but the assumptions remained. Or was the idea of a woman with an uncontainable emotional life too unsettling for the rational world of men? Ailing women would sleep in temple precincts and act cold, dream, or vision to cure their condition. He called it suffocation of the womb, a term that would endure for centuries in medical manuals. What's fascinating is how this belief system intersected with spiritual thought. Sometimes, healing came not in the form of medicine, but of mythic symbolism. This ambiguity gave rise to overlapping treatments: medical, ritualistic, and domestic. Inhalations of aromatic herbs, application of pessaries, mixtures of herbs or oils inserted into the vagina, dietary changes, including wine or honey, for soothing the womb, temple offerings or prayers to fertility goddesses, encouragement to marry or bear children as a cure. And always, beneath it all, was the unshakable belief: a woman without a child was incomplete and therefore unstable. This view seeped into daily life. Mothers worried when their daughters reached adulthood without a husband, not just for social reasons, but for their health. In many ways, the theory of the wandering womb became a tool of social order. It explained away women's dissent, silenced their complaints, and folded complex inner lives into simple biological explanations. This simplification was convenient and dangerous. Even those women who might have benefited from rest or therapy were instead prescribed marriage or childbirth as medicine. And yet, not all women were passive in this framework. Some sought treatment actively, consulting midwives and folk healers who operated outside elite medicine. Still, the dominant medical narrative remained clear. Women were emotionally unstable because of their wombs, and only by keeping the womb satisfied sexually or reproductively could balance be restored. This thinking echoed across the Mediterranean and beyond. Ancient Egyptian, Indian, and even some early Islamic medical writings reflected similar ideas, though with different terminology. In a way, it was a backhanded compliment. Menstrual cycles, pregnancy, and childbirth, all these reminded ancient observers that women's bodies could do things men's could not. By the late Roman Empire, these ideas were deeply entrenched in Western medicine and would go on to shape medieval and early modern European thought. Even as medicine advanced, moving from humors to anatomy, from theory to experimental, idea that women's emotions stemmed from reproductive dysfunction stuck like sediment at the bottom of medical knowledge. And so, the question lingers: how much of ancient belief was born from ignorance, and how much from fear? Was it truly the womb that disturbed the mind? The theory of the wandering womb, though eventually discarded by modern medicine, left a surprisingly enduring legacy. As the classical world gave way to the Christianized medieval era, the language of female health began to shift from natural philosophy to theology. But the underlying ideas stayed much the same. The womb remained central to understanding women's distress, and the concept of hysteria, born from Hippocratic and Galenic ideas, began a long migration through time-adapting, persistent remedies. Included baths, oils, and scented treatments nearly identical to those recommended over 1,000 years earlier in ancient Greece. Ancient doctors were often keen. They observed, for instance, that certain emotional disturbances followed menstruation or childbirth. That women who experienced trauma often had chest pains or difficulty breathing. That the body and mind were connected. Physicians like Thomas Sydenham, often called the English continued to link hysteria with reproductive function, but he also began to note that men, too, could show similar symptoms. It became a catch-all diagnosis for everything from fainting and irritability to seizures, sexual frustration, or depression. Any behavior deemed irrational, disruptive, or inconvenient in women could be filed neatly under hysteria. These women, often traumatized or neglected, were coaxed into fits before an audience of male physicians and students. Their tremors and contortions were studied, diagrammed, and cataloged. This observation quietly undermined the original idea of the wandering womb. For centuries, women were institutionalized, locked away in asylums because of hysteria, treated not with empathy or counseling, but with bleedings, purgings, isolation, or even surgical removal of reproductive organs. With the advent of neuroscience, psychology, and endocrinology, physicians started to recognize that mood disorders, anxiety, and trauma affected all genders and were rooted in complex, multifactorial. His theories, while progressive in some ways, still reinforced the belief that women's emotional lives were unstable, a direct heir to the wandering womb, dressed in new language. From 5th century BCE Greece to 19th century Austria, the same underlying theme persisted. Women were vulnerable to emotional and physical breakdowns. Because of their biology, women are still more likely to be prescribed sedatives than men for the same symptoms. Their pain is more often dismissed. Their emotional reactions are more likely to be labeled dramatic or exaggerated. But in many ways, its ghost still lingers. In emergency rooms, they may wait longer for treatment, especially for complaints like chest pain or fatigue. The vocabulary changed. The tools evolved, but the assumptions were hard to shake. In time, the concept would be medicalized, stripped of its ancient roots, but retaining its old prejudice that women's emotions were not just intense, they were pathological. If men could experience fits, tremors, and fainting, then perhaps the womb wasn't solely to blame after all. The womb had become a ghost of phantom organ haunting the minds of doctors for millennia. In the early medieval period, the spiritual realm took over where Hippocrates left off. He theorized that their symptoms, paralysis, mutism, hallucinations, were not caused by a wandering womb, but by repressed memories and desires. This was a turning point. Freud's ideas would lay the groundwork for modern psychoanalysis and help move the conversation from uterus to mind. Female suffering, especially when physical symptoms had no visible cause, was increasingly attributed to possession, moral failing, or divine punishment. But even then, the echoes of ancient belief remained. Something internal had gone wrong, something linked to the feminine body. The real root cause is loss, fear, stress, social pressure, mained, while the physical body was blamed and controlled. Texts such as a set of medieval medical writings from the 11th century aimed at women's health still discuss treatments for uterine suffocation. And yet, despite how strange these beliefs may seem now, they were not entirely without observation. The problem was interpretation rather than understanding trauma, grief, or anxiety on their own terms. Ancient and medieval physicians blamed the womb. By the 17th century, hysteria would become a formal diagnosis in European medical texts. Still, the term hysteria persisted, drawn directly from the Greek hystera, meaning womb. And this was no small matter. By the 19th century, doctors like Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris were staging public demonstrations of hysterical women in lecture halls. One of Charcot's students was a young doctor named Sigmund Freud. Freud began his career studying hysteria, particularly among upper-class women in Vienna. Yet even Freud could not fully escape the past. He still saw female psychology as mysterious, prone to emotional excess, and heavily centered around sexuality and motherhood. What makes this history so striking is how long it endured. Only in the 20th century did medicine begin to truly separate female emotion from reproductive pathology, but the cultural shadow remained. Even today, the legacy of hysteria shows itself in subtle ways. And when a woman raises her voice, or weeps in public, or withdraws completely, there are still echoes of that ancient idea that something inside her is unbalanced, off, or wrong. The wandering womb may be gone from textbooks. What if the ancient Greeks, with all their flawed theories, were simply trying to describe what we still struggled to articulate, a cry for help with no visible cause? And what if, after all this time, we're still learning how to truly listen in the hushed stone corridors of medieval monasteries? A different kind of affliction settled quietly into the lives of women. It wasn't marked by plague boils or festering wounds. A woman who cried uncontrollably, fasted to the point of collapse, or trembled in religious ecstasy might be declared a living saint, touched by the divine. In a society where marriage and childbirth were often a woman's only socially acceptable paths, the religious life gave access to education, community, and spiritual purpose. but it also became a setting where mental distress, what we might now label anxiety, depression, trauma, or psychosis, was given spiritual meaning. Or she might be suspected of possession, marked as a heretic, or quietly hidden away in a cell and left to pray the madness away. It all depended on context, on status, and on how the behavior was interpreted by those around her. These stories described ecstatic visions, divine encounters, and bouts of holy weeping. But between the lines, we can hear something else. Long nights without sleep, isolation, starvation, and overwhelming pressure to be perfect in the eyes of God. But by trembling hands, visions of angels and demons, sleepless nights, sudden fainting, and whispered voices in the dark. For some women, these rules were grounding. For others, they became a prison, confined to tight schedules, restricted from speaking freely, and tasked with spiritual perfection. Many women found themselves trapped between faith and fear. These were not the wounds of the body, but of the soul, so it was believed. But visions also served as outlets for inner chaos, moments when the boundaries of the self dissolved into something that could be interpreted, at least by the community, as divine. If a nun saw angels, she was blessed. If she heard voices, they might be saints or demons. But when these failed to ease a woman's torment, the community faced a difficult choice. Others were quietly removed from their positions or exorcised by the local priest. There were few treatments in the modern sense, no medication, no psychological support, no understanding of trauma, or no. Was she being tested by God, or was she becoming a danger to the others? Pronounced dead in her early 20s, she famously awoke during her own funeral, sat up in her coffin. Some mystics, knowing the language of sainthood, performed their ecstasies. They shaped their visions to reflect biblical patterns. They cultivated reputations for holiness that brought protection, fame, and even influence. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen or Julian of Norwich, while not considered mad, described visionary experiences that might today raise psychiatric questions. Was she terrified of damnation? Was she experiencing psychosis? Or was she, in the eyes of her peers, just very holy? Many thought her mad. Others declared her a saint. She claimed to have visions of heaven, hell, and purgatory. A woman who whipped herself bloody in penance might be praised for her piety. A woman who wept uncontrollably before the altar might be seen as touched by grace. But if her behavior became too strange, too disturbing, too difficult to manage, she might be suspected of harboring the devil. Today, some historians read her story as one of untreated trauma or schizophrenia, masked by religious devotion. But in her time, she was both revered and feared, a woman whose suffering was interpreted through the lens of Christian theology. She cried loudly and often in church, wailed during sermons, and claimed to receive direct revelations from Christ. Her behavior was so extreme that she was nearly tried for heresy, and yet she left behind one of the first autobiographies in the English language, describing her spiritual journey in her own voice. Some scholars see in her story the marks of postpartum depression, religious obsession, or chronic anxiety. But in her world, these states were inseparable from holiness, and flew into the rafters of the church, refusing to come down because she could not bear the smell of sin emanating from the mourners. In the medieval imagination, the boundary between sickness and sanctity was thin and permeable. For many women in the Middle Ages, particularly in Christian Europe, between the 11th and 14th centuries, the monastery offered a rare form of autonomy. Take, for example, the case of Christina the Astonishing, a 12th century woman from Belgium who suffered what we now likely call a severe psychological break after a seizure-like collapse. Her life after that was marked by extreme behavior. She threw herself into fires, submerged herself in freezing rivers, and chained herself up in solitary prayer. Christina was not alone. In monasteries across Europe, nuns who experienced intense emotions or strange behaviors were often recorded in hagiographies, the biographies of saints. The Benedictine rule, which governed many monastic communities, demanded silence, humility, obedience, and strict routines. Some coped by turning inward. Visions became a common expression of spiritual devotion, and that was the danger. Because in this period, madness and sanctity looked eerily similar. This ambiguity led to a terrifying possibility. The same woman could be canonized or condemned, depending on how her actions were read. For instance, in the case of Marjorie Kemp, a 15th century English mystic, we find a woman whose intense emotional life often left those around her baffled and annoyed. And so, monasteries became spaces where emotional suffering was both hidden and displayed behind the thick stone walls. There were rituals meant to protect the soul, exorcisms, prayer cycles, fasting and self-confession and penance. In some cases, nuns who could not function were locked in isolation cells, given over to long-term penance. What existed was theology, and in theology, pain had purpose. Suffering was redemptive. Madness could be a gift or a curse. Interestingly, there were women who used this ambiguity to their advantage. But for every Hildegard, there were countless anonymous women, lay sisters, anchoresses, who suffered in silence, their anguish swallowed by the monastery walls, and so were left with an unsettling question. When a woman wept before a crucifix for hours, was she grieving a lost child? In the end, no one really knew. They only knew that her pain had to mean something. To understand how madness was treated inside medieval monastic walls, one must examine the peculiar ritual economy of suffering that shaped life within them. The daily rhythms of prayer, fasting, and obedience created an environment where extreme states of mind were not only tolerated but sometimes expected. These prayers began long before sunrise and continued late into the night, often requiring nuns to wake before dawn, chanting cold chapels, and sleep in short intervals. Over time, such conditions contributed to chronic sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and emotional strain for someone already carrying unresolved trauma, grief, or anxiety. This environment could become a crucible. Consider the structure of the divine officer system of 8 daily prayers that punctuated the monastic day. But in the medieval monastery, these experiences were seen as evidence of divine touch. Manuals for priests and confessors included chapters on how to discern between holy ecstasy and demonic madness. These texts posed diagnostic questions. Was the woman's vision consistent with Scripture? Did her revelations challenge church authority? Did she display humility, or did she speak with arrogance? Emotional suffering could be, even so long as it was contained and directed toward accepted religious forms. Visions, tears, and ecstatic tremors were not symptoms, they were spiritual achievements. A small convent, isolated and bonded by shared hardship, might see a troubled sister not as a danger, but as someone in need of care. Oral histories and local records describe simple, tender rituals. Women praying beside a weeping sister, holding her during fits, or singing quietly to calm her. When fear overtook her, she believed her grief and anguish brought her closer to divine truth. Though her behavior was extreme, she was eventually canonized, and her writings were preserved by male confessors who saw in her pain a kind of sacred wisdom. The line was razor thin. A vision of the Virgin Mary might draw crowds and donations. Their pain can make them sacred or dangerous. One abbot might interpret a nun's visions as a divine message. Another might see them as dangerous illusions. The woman herself had little say. Their very suffering was seen as a conduit to God. But speaking in tongues for too long, screaming in the middle of the night, or disturbing communal prayer could prompt suspicions of possession or demonic influence. Their words, if they survive at all, are filtered through the voices of male scribes, confessors, and chroniclers, records of women who spoke too freely or wept too long in the presence of priests. In each of these, we see flashes of a deeper truth, that these were people, not merely spiritual vessels, and that their suffering, while interpreted through the lens of theology, was still raw and human. And when those emotions spilled over, the response was not medical support but ritual correction. Their symptoms: panic, withdrawal, ecstatic joy, and obsessive thoughts are dressed in religious language. We cannot know with certainty whether a trembling hand was spiritual fervor or untreated trauma, whether a night of weeping was grief for a lost family or a mystical experience of the passion. Some were hidden, others were punished, and many simply disappeared from the record, their names lost in the silence of the cloister. Without the relative protection of religious community, women exhibiting signs of mental illness could be accused of witchcraft, a subject we'll return to in the next story. Modern psychology understands that sensory deprivation, repetitive chanting, and sleep disruption can induce altered mental states, especially in highly suggestible individuals, at least until they became inconvenient. Or was she trying, in the only way she could, to be heard? In several convents, especially by the 13th and 14th centuries, records appear of nuns being confined, silenced, or even exorcised when their behavior strayed too far beyond the acceptable bounds of piety. This duality placed women in a precarious bind. In fact, some monasteries began to formalize their approaches. If she wept and claimed to see saints, she might be believed. If she preached or contradicted doctrine, she might be punished. This method of control served a broader purpose. It ensured that even a woman experiencing visions would remain within the strict hierarchy of church authority. But there were exceptions. In some rare cases, the community itself protected the women in their midst who suffered, and sometimes these women became spiritual leaders. One such example is Angela of Foligno, a 13th century mystic whose emotional turbulence, intense weeping, fasting, and trembling became part of her spiritual identity. Angela's story reveals a quiet power at play. When women's suffering was translatable into religious narrative, it could be legitimized. But the opposite was just as true. Women whose experiences could not be translated, whose fear, despair, or hallucinations disrupted the theological framework, were often left to languish. For those outside the monasteries, laywomen who lived on the fringes of society, the consequences were often even harsher. But even within sacred walls, the treatment of female madness remained unpredictable. It is here that the historical silence grows loud, because these women rarely left personal records. What we can know is that they were real women, living in close quarters, under rigid rules, navigating lives of extreme emotional discipline. And yet, beneath that structure, there were cracks. There were glimpses of resistance, even within the cloister. Nuns who refused to participate in communal prayers, women who collapsed in protests during processions. So we return to the central ambiguity. When a woman trembled in a candlelit chapel, was she speaking to God? And if she couldn't tell the difference, who could? By the late medieval period, the fascination with female mysticism was at its height. Religious texts circulated tales of nuns and anchoresses who claimed to experience the divine through pain, hunger, and silence, and the rise of inquisitorial authority. These same women were increasingly subject to scrutiny, suspicion, and suppression. The boundary between holy and heretical became, and women caught in emotional distress risked falling on the wrong side of that line. These women, isolated in cells or cloisters, were seen as spiritual intermediaries, closer to God, precisely because they suffered more intensely than ordinary people. But as church institutions tightened control over orthodoxy, especially in the wake of various heresies, they acknowledged that some women might genuinely receive divine visions, but they were deeply concerned about the danger of female imagination, which they believed was more susceptible to illusion, temptation, and falsehood. In short, the female mind was still viewed as emotionally unstable and spiritually volatile. There was no framework for trauma, no concept of psychological disorder, only the language of sin, sanctity, and the soul. Julian of Norwich, for example, suffered a near-fatal illness and described her mystical experiences in the form of showings, visions of Christ that brought her comfort and insight. Her visions were accepted, and her writings preserved. Her reflections, though steeped in medieval theology, are remarkably gentle and emotionally intelligent. She wrote of God's love with a maternal tenderness rare for the time, suggesting a quiet rebellion against more punitive religious interpretations. It was during this period that church authorities began to more explicitly police the line between divine vision and mental instability. A woman who had once been seen as touched by grace might suddenly be silenced or punished if her revelations challenged church hierarchy or theology. For understanding, for peace, for connection, their tears were not always signs of holy ecstasy. Sometimes they were just tears. And women who once stood on the threshold between saint and seer were increasingly labeled as problematic, unstable, or even dangerous. Her symptoms, visions, ecstasies, voices could now be reinterpreted not as gifts from heaven, but as signs of deception or even diabolical interference. But it's also worth recognizing that within the harsh confines of monastic life, some women found the language, however flawed, to express inner turmoil. In a world that lacked psychological vocabulary, mysticism became a form of survival, a way to name what hurt. A nun might experience sudden panic, intrusive thoughts, or a deep melancholy, what we now recognize as symptoms of mental illness. But rather than counseling or therapy, she would be advised to confess, fast, and pray more fervently. She enters a convent for sanctuary, only to find herself locked in silence. Her suffering sanctified, but never truly addressed. Some were sent back to their families. If they had any, though shame and poverty often awaited them. From the pressure of sainthood, from a mind unraveling in silence. The writings of influential male theologians like Thomas Aquinas and later inquisitors show this shift. In some cases, women who experienced what we deem now call chronic anxiety or hallucinatory episodes were confined in cells by their own requester, under subtle pressure from their communities. These anchorites lived in permanent solitude, sometimes for decades, with only a small window through which they received food and gave spiritual advice. While some sought this life freely, others may have had few choices left. This shift had consequences. Some women, fearing accusation or punishment, began to downplaying their visions or seeking male approval for their experiences. Others were denounced. A few were imprisoned or tried. And yet, mysticism and madness remained stubbornly intertwined. In convents, daily life continued under a veil of tension. Some accounts even describe nuns who pleaded for help for release from disturbing dreams, uncontrollable crying, or terrifying hallucinations, only to be instructed to renew their vows, seek forgiveness, or endure in silence. And yet, within these harsh frameworks, some women created meaning from their suffering. They composed prayers and poems. They recorded their visions. They turned their isolation into profound theological meditation. Julian was fortunate. Others were not so lucky. Some convent records mention women who were removed from public worship, deemed unfit for community life. Their names were often struck from official rolls. Others were placed in long-term isolation. One of the most haunting practices was the voluntary enclosure of the mentally unwell. Imagine, then, a young woman unmarried, grieving, terrified by visions she cannot explain. And yet, in many of these women's words, if we are lucky enough to find them preserved, we hear not madness, but longing. By the 15th century, the theological system that had once celebrated female suffering began to contract. Mysticism gave way to doctrine. Emotion was increasingly suspect. The Reformation and subsequent religious conflicts would alter the landscape further. But the medieval era left behind a powerful and lingering idea that women's emotional distress, especially in spiritual spaces, was not illness but a test of faith. It's tempting now to look back and judge, to say they misunderstood, that they failed these women. And in many ways, they did. And so we ask, when Christina the Astonishing climbed into the rafters at her funeral, was she running from grief? And if her community had listened not just to her visions, but to her pain, would her story have been different? She wept too often. She spoke to herself at night. She walked the fields alone. She cursed under her breath. The animals feared her. The bread never rose when she touched it. And one day, when the village child fell ill, someone pointed toward her Cudagund, whispered the word that would unravel her life. Which, in early modern Europe, from roughly 1450 to 1750, Tens of thousands of women, most of them poor, widowed, or simply unusual, were accused of witchcraft. Of these, many were tortured, imprisoned, or executed. But behind the stories of spells and pacts with the devil lies a quieter, more troubling possibility that some of these so-called witches were not wicked at all, just mentally unwell. As the medieval worldview gave way to the early modern one, the theological explanations of madness merged with growing fears of heresy, superstition, and diabolical influence. The church's influence was still vast, but new anxiety stirred in the face of plagues, wars, crop failures, and religious schisms. Many were older, living on the edges of towns or villages. Others were midwives, herbalists, or healers whose knowledge, once respected, had become suspect. Still more were young women with unstable behavior. They cried too easily, experienced seizures, spoke in fragments, or reported hearing voices. People were afraid, desperately so, and in that fear, they sought to name and root out invisible threats. Today, we might recognize this as a symptom of schizophrenia or a severe anxiety disorder, though dressed in theological language. Its framework was deeply misogynistic and dismissive of any psychological nuance. Women, the book claimed, were more susceptible to demonic influence because they were weaker in faith and more governed by emotion. They were evidence of satanic infiltration. But to the community, it meant only one thing. She had invited the devil in and often executed, not for any real crime, but for expressing symptoms they could not control. Mental illness, which had always been difficult to understand, now became something even more dangerous. A potential sign of demonic presence. They claimed to fly on broomsticks, to speak with the devil, and to curse their neighbor's livestock. She was seen wandering barefoot, muttering that she had spoken to a shadow man. The court concluded she had engaged in a demonic pact. In some parts of Europe, folk communities quietly supported their troubled members, offering herbal remedies, prayer circles, and protection against accusations. In Iceland, for instance, women were rarely executed, for witchcraft men were more often the targets. In rural Wales and parts of Scandinavia, female healers retained respect long after their counterparts in France or Germany were driven underground. Today, we might call this paranoia, disassociation, or auditory hallucination. But in a world without psychiatry, it was interpreted only one way. The language to describe psychological pain simply didn't exist in most vernacular cultures. A woman might be called mad, touched, or fey, but not depressed, traumatized, or scared. And so treatment, when it came, was spiritual. Pilgrimage, prayer, holy water, confession, or exorcism. There was no room for ambiguity. A woman in distress was either holy, dangerous, or both. But many of these confessions were coerced under threat of violence or born from delusions spurred by untreated mental illness and chronic fear. Because they couldn't sleep. Because they spoke when they were told to be silent. If the accused drowned, she was innocent. If she floated, she was a witch. The women caught in this storm often shared eerily similar profiles. And misfortune is proof of evil. Your symptoms begin to take the shape of your... A woman suffering from anxiety may begin to believe she is cursed. A girl with intrusive thoughts may assume she's been possessed. In such a world, hallucinations are not abnormalities. They are dangerous confirmations. In one documented case from 16th century Switzerland, a woman was accused of witchcraft after her neighbors reported that she screamed at night and claimed to see black figures in her room, and vulnerable women internalizing the worst possible narratives about their pain. The infamous Malleus, a witch hunting manual published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, offered detailed instructions for identifying and prosecuting witches. It listed signs of witchcraft that today read like a psychiatric checklist: sudden mood swings, sleep disturbances, screaming or laughing inappropriately, fear of religious objects, hallucinations, withdrawal or refusal to speak, inability to eat or drink. None of these symptoms were seen as medical, and so women who suffered emotional breakdowns, post-traumatic episodes, or neurological disorders were interrogated, tortured, in places like Germany, Scotland, France, and parts of Eastern Europe, the records of which trials reveal chilling details. Women confessing to impossible things after long hours of questioning. One German trial in the 1590s involved a woman who believed her thoughts were being stolen at night. And it wasn't just how others saw them, it was also how the women saw themselves. When you live in a culture where spiritual warfare is real, where dreams are messages, this created a perfect storm. Communities are looking for religious authorities, eager to purge perceived evil. But not every case was so dire. Yet even in these regions, mental illness remained deeply misunderstood. In more extreme cases, suspected witches were subjected to ordeal by water or fire, torturous tests that did little more than reflect community fear. The cruelty of this logic is hard to overstate, and yet, through this dark chapter of European history, we glimpse a recurring pattern. Emotional suffering framed as moral or spiritual failure. So we are left to wonder, how many women lost their lives not because they were witches but because they wept in public? And if they had been born a few centuries later, would they have been treated or still accused? The early modern period brought not only escalating fear of witchcraft, but also new attempts to formalize the process of accusation and punishment, particularly through the rise of legal procedures and the growth of inquisitorial systems in Catholic and Protestant regions alike. In fact, it often made things worse. But legal structure did not mean fairness. In an age where forensic evidence did not exist, the confession became king. But a confession didn't always come willingly. Everything from the number of cats she kept to the way she spoke when nervous was used to build a narrative of guilt. And when she finally stood before a tribunal, she often faced a panel of male judges, clerics, and physicians, none of whom understood, nor attempted to understand, what we might now call mental health. Once accused, a woman's odd behavior, emotional instability, or social isolation became part of a growing case file against her. Today, such statements would prompt careful psychological evaluation. But in widows, women with physical disabilities, women with speech impairments, or women who had survived violence often became targets. In some cases, they were already living on the margins, poor, unprotected, and isolated. If their behavior was unusual, it was interpreted through a lens of supernatural fear. Rather than compassionate care, they were treated as evidence of a pact with Satan. One girl confessed to meeting the devil in the forest and dancing naked. But as the investigation unfolded, Inquisition officials began to suspect that the entire community had been caught in a moral panic, driven by fear, peer pressure, and imagination. Janet was described as confused, muttering to herself, and unable to explain her actions clearly. Her daughter had a physical deformity. Neighbors said Janet had ridden a girl like a horse, an absurd claim likely rooted in delusion, misunderstanding, or superstition. Many simply faded into obscurity, socially destroyed by accusation alone. The psychological scars were immense. We know little of how they coped, but it's likely some never recovered. Janet was burned alive. Her daughter escaped. These rare documents show not only their fear, but also their confusion. Many truly didn't understand what they were being accused of. Their mental distress made them unreliable narrators of their own lives. Remarkably, some inquisitors began to recognize that no real witchcraft had occurred, and yet the damage was done. People had already died. One of the most terrifying elements of this period was the use of proof by confession. Or was it about punishing the inconvenient, the sad, the angry, the strange, the mad? Under these conditions, a woman who had never harmed anyone, but who had wept alone too often or spoken to herself while walking, might find herself strapped to a bench, thumbs crushed in a vice, or suspended by her wrists until her shoulders dislocated. She spoke nonsense and refused food. This was enough. She was burned at the stake. Torture was not just permitted, it was codified in legal systems across much of Europe. In a world plagued by war, famine, disease, and social upheaval, the odd woman became a receptacle for fear. Her trembling hand stood in for failing crops. Her midnight sobbing became the sound of children dying. Her stare, vacant or piercing, reminded people of the things they couldn't control. Over 900 people, men, women, and even children were executed for witchcraft. The overwhelming majority were women, many of whom had no family to protect them. Local chroniclers noted that some of the accused were mad or not in their right mind, but rather than being spared, their mental distress became further proof of guilt in pain, confusion, and panic. She would say what they wanted to hear. Some confessed to flying through the night to attend Sabbaths with the devil. If a woman cried too much, she was possessed. If she cried too little, she was hiding something. There was no safe expression of distress. Others claimed they had poisoned wells or turned into animals. Some even confessed to harming infants often, after being coached or prompted during interrogations. The more vivid the confession, the more certain the court became of guilt, and the stories she told under torture were often bizarre, surreal, or tragic. But modern scholars reviewing these records have noticed something important. Many of these women seem to have had symptoms of psychosis, PTSD, or neurological disorders, and their confessions echo those patterns. They described hearing voices, feeling compelled to do things they didn't understand, being followed by shadows, or feeling that their thoughts weren't their own. What's more, these confessions were often coerced from people already known to be vulnerable. In the famous Basque witch trials of the early 17th century, conducted by the Spanish Inquisition, hundreds of people were accused, many of them young girls or elderly women. Other trials were less forgiving. In Würzburg, Germany, from 1626 to 1631, a particularly horrific set of trials took place. One entry reads, "She howled all night and tore hair." What's striking is how emotional behavior itself was viewed as suspicious. In Scotland, the famous case of Janet Hornexy, one of the last legal executions for witchcraft in the British Isles, reveals this tragic dynamic. And what of the women who weren't executed? Some were banished. Others were imprisoned for years, in appalling conditions. A few left behind fragments, scribbled pleas of innocence, confession notes, or letters to husbands and children. Yet the courts, hungry for evidence, made them narrate anyway. And this raises a deeper question about the culture of the time. Was this massive, coordinated persecution truly about rooting out evil? In a way, these women became mirrors for their communities' anxieties. It was easier to believe she was a witch than to believe she was sick. It was easier to burn her than to understand her. As the 18th century drew near, the flames of the great witch hunts began to die down across Europe. Enlightenment thinking, with its emphasis on reason, science, and skepticism of superstition, began to take root. Legal reforms were introduced, and growing voices within intellectual and religious circles questioned whether witchcraft even existed at all. But even as the formal trials dwindled, the social and emotional legacy of this era remained, particularly for women whose minds and behavior defied easy understanding. Across many European communities, the association between mental instability and spiritual danger persisted. While fewer women were publicly executed for witchcraft, many were still ostracized, institutionalized, or simply feared. She alternated between states of depression and energetic euphoria, losing memory of her other self. She was not accused of witchcraft, but she was viewed with suspicion, even fear. The image of the old crone, muttering to herself in the forest, lived on in folklore and superstition even as the courts stopped prosecuting. Her doctors puzzled over her symptoms, but offered little relief. The young girl who talked to herself. These women may not have faced formal charges, but they were still watched, feared, and excluded. In another century, she might have faced a very different fate. Families conducted quiet rituals to protect against the evil eye or the return of a cursed soul. And when a woman fell ill with what we now recognize as psychogenic symptoms, some still sought folk healers, charms, or exorcisms, anything to restore balance. But the conflation of female emotion with deviance did not. It simply changed costumes. The question had shifted from, is she a witch, to something more elusive. What is wrong with her? Asylums began to appear, replacing dungeons and ecclesiastical prisons, but they were often places of misery, neglect, and confinement rather than healing. Diagnoses like hysteria, a term directly derived from the Greek hystera, or womb-replaced accusations of sorcery. How many women are still told they're too emotional? How often are their symptoms dismissed or misdiagnosed? How much fear still surrounds female emotion? But the core belief remained unchanged. When a woman suffered uncontrollably or inexplicably, she was no longer simply unwell. She was dangerous, irrational. Other women who once might have been called witches were now labeled as lunatics, melancholics, or hysteric sand, locked away all the same. Consider the lonely woman in the woods, the cursed maiden, or the woman burned for loving the wrong man or speaking too freely. These characters echo real lives, those of women whose grief, madness, or trauma was never seen as valid, only as threatening. Unfortunately, early psychiatry offered few answers. A woman who cried uncontrollably in 1600 might have been burned as a witch. In 1750, she might be bled, purged, or placed in an asylum. Neither era fully asked the deeper questions. What caused her distress? What grief, trauma, or illness haunted her? In the 1700s, madness began to be studied as a natural but the shift was far from compassionate. The language changed. The punishment did not. Take, for instance, the case of Mary Reynolds, a woman in late 18th century England who suffered from what we'd now describe as dissociative identity disorder. What is important to understand is that the mechanisms of pathologizing female behavior had merely been transferred from the religious to the medical realm, and throughout all this, the archetype of the witch, as a mentally unwell woman, remained rooted in the cultural imagination. In rural villages, people still whispered about touched women, the herbalist who never married, the widow who stared too long. In parts of Eastern Europe and the Scottish Highlands, witchcraft beliefs persisted into the 19th century. The legacy of the witch trials endured in more than just records and laws. It endured in how communities understood female pain. Even into the Victorian era, physicians routinely linked mental illness in women to reproductive function, emotion, and female weakness, and society treated her accordingly. The modern witch trials may have ended. In literature, film, and folklore, the witch remains a powerful symbol, but often rooted in misunderstood pain. And so, when we look back at the vast record of witch trials, we must ask, how many women were punished, not for malice but for being too sensitive, too strange, too sad? How many were mentally ill, traumatized, or neurodivergent and met not compassion, but condemnation? The question lingers still, as we consider how mental health is handled even today. The witch may be gone from the courtroom, but she is not gone from the culture, and neither is the unease that surrounds a woman who suffers without explanation. In the dim parlors and echoing drawing rooms of Victorian Britain and America, a quiet epidemic was spreading, one that left no physical marks, but filled hospitals, therapy chairs, and doctors' ledgers with cases of invisible suffering. Women, often middle or upper class, were being diagnosed with a peculiar affliction known simply as hysteria. But to the Victorian physician, the diagnosis was more anatomical. The culprit was, once again, the uterus. They complained of fatigue, irritability, dizziness, shortness of breath. Some fainted during conversation. Others grew withdrawn or unreasonably anxious. It allowed them to say, here is the cause, while avoiding the deeper, more uncomfortable questions of trauma, abuse, oppression, or loneliness. Victorian ideals of femininity praised gentleness, purity, and a woman was expected to serve as the moral center of the home, to be quiet, agreeable, and but this ideal came at a cost. Many women had little autonomy, no legal rights over property or custody, and virtually no say in their medical or marital lives. Some developed trembling limbs, sexual disinterest, or strange physical tics. It was believed that this procedure would release tensions caused by unfulfilled reproductive urges. Women were confined to their rooms, forbidden from reading, writing, or interacting with family. They were overfed, massaged, and instructed to do absolutely nothing often, for weeks or months. This procedure was not uncommon in both the UK and US during the latter half of the 19th century, and autonomy were subjected to the medical gaze, and often mutilated in the name of cure. It was believed to cure hysteria, masturbation, and rebellious behavior. They were suffering, yes, but from powerlessness, from the crushing weight of expectation, from abuse, neglect, bereavement, or isolation. But rather than listening to their pain, society converted it into pathology. Rather than asking, "What has happened to you?" doctors asked, "What is wrong with your uterus?" The method was so widespread that some doctors developed mechanical vibrating devices to speed up the process, an early forerunner to the vibrator, which was, at the time, a medical instrument. Those who demanded change, especially in marriage, education, or sexual autonomy, were often diagnosed with neurasthenia, melancholia, or nervous conditions. It might manifest as a racing heart, chronic fatigue, a sudden aversion to touch, or bouts of sobbing she could not explain. But rather than being taken seriously, her suffering was reinterpreted as illness of the uterus. Anna suffered from partial paralysis, hallucinations, and aphasia. But a treatment marked a turning point. Breuer found that when she recounted her traumatic memories, her symptoms improved. This observation would later help Freud develop psychoanalysis, and it quietly undermined the dominant belief that hysteria was purely biological. This included ovaryectomies, removal of the ovaries, or even hysterectomies, the complete removal of the uterus. In the meantime, countless women were labeled hysterical and subjected to procedures that stripped them of bodily integrity and agency. The rationale: if the uterus caused emotional disorder, then removing it might bring peace. These surgeries were often performed without anesthesia, and patients rarely gave full, informed consent. A few became completely non-verbal, and still others collapsed without warning, whispering incoherent thoughts. It was a catch-all term, used when no physical illness could be found, but the patient clearly wasn't well. Anything from emotional outbursts to menstrual pain, disobedience to sexual reluctance could be interpreted as symptoms to modern clinicians. This suite of symptoms might suggest depression, anxiety disorders, trauma, or neurological illness. Even after centuries of evolving thought, medicine remained haunted by the same ancient conclusion. Women's minds were governed by their reproductive systems, and when the womb fell out of balance, the emotions did too. The term hysteria comes directly from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb. It had been around since Hippocrates' time, passed down through Galen, medieval theorists, and Renaissance doctors. But in the 19th century, hysteria became an almost fashionable diagnosis, a medical explanation for the myriad ways women's suffering didn't fit into neat physical categories, and it became incredibly common. According to some estimates, up to 75% of women admitted to asylums in the 1800s were diagnosed with hysteria or a related disorder. What made hysteria so seductive to Victorian doctors was that it pathologized female emotion, while giving the illusion of science. The typical patient was often a married woman, young or middle-aged, who lived a comfortable but deeply restricted life. So when she began to feel trapped, emotionally stifled, creatively unfulfilled, or sexually, enter the physician. Victorian doctors, almost exclusively male, responded to hysteria with a variety of treatments, many of them startling in their invasive intimacy. One common approach was the pelvic massage, in which the physician manually stimulated the woman until she experienced hysterical paroxysm, a euphemism for orgasm. Another treatment was isolation, also known as the rest cure, which will be explored in depth in the next story. In more extreme cases, the physician might recommend surgical intervention. In 1872, The British Medical Journal reported a case in which a woman was subjected to clitoridectomy, the removal of the clitoris, because she was deemed too emotional. What emerges from this history is a chilling pattern. Women's emotions, bodies. The irony, of course, is that many of these women were not ill in the traditional sense. One of the most famous cases to come out of this period was Anna O., a pseudonym for Bertha Pauw, a patient treated by Dr. Joseph Breuer, mentor of Sigmund Freud. Still, it would take decades for that insight to spread. And even as the diagnosis of hysteria began to fall out of favor in the early 20th century, its core assumptions lingered. Women who expressed too much emotion were still seen as fragile. Those who resisted authority were still seen as unstable. The language shifted, but the skepticism remained. So we returned to the drawing room, to the pale-faced woman lying on the fainting couch. Was she mad, sick, or just profoundly unhurt? And what might have changed if someone had asked not about her womb but about her world? By the mid to late 19th century, hysteria had become more than just a medical diagnosis. It was a cultural shorthand for what society feared most about women: unpredictability, sexual autonomy, emotional power, and resistance to control. This made hysteria a convenient container for all kinds of non-conforming behavior. A woman who wept too easily, a girl who disobeyed her father, a wife who refused her husband's advances, a daughter who read too many novels or spent too long staring at the horizon. In Victorian eyes, all could be classified as signs of moral or reproductive dysfunction, conveniently blamed on the uterus. Disagreeing with him publicly on matters of religion, he claimed she was insane. Under the laws of the time, he didn't need a doctor's approval. A husband's word was enough. Most women's voices were never heard again, and nowhere was this more visible than in the medical institutions of the time. Sims developed surgical tools and procedures that would eventually lead to modern techniques. But his work was built, in part, on highly unethical experiments many performed without anesthesia on enslaved black women whose pain was deemed irrelevant or exaggerated. These procedures were later adapted and used on white women deemed hysterical, particularly those who resisted sexual intimacy or showed signs of mental distress. These often included morphine, alcohol, or chloroform substances that dulled sensation rather than healed anything. Advertisements promised relief from female troubles without addressing the root causes. In essence, women were medicated into silence. Across Europe and North America, asylums for women were built to house those deemed incurably hysterical. Some surgeons even performed clitoridectomies, hoping to extinguish female sexuality entirely. These sprawling, austere facilities housed patients with a vast range of conditions from epilepsy and bipolar disorder to trauma, grief, and perfectly normal sadness. The most famous example may be Charlotte Perkins Gilman, whose 1892 short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, captured the creeping horror of the rest cure. Based on her own experience with Dr. Silas, where Mitchell Gilman's protagonist is a woman confined to her room, forbidden from writing, her every need controlled by her husband, it splintered into new diagnoses: neurasthenia, psychasthenia, and conversion disorder. Women were no longer accused of having unruly wombs, but of having fragile nerves or unconscious conflicts, and still, their pain was often minimized or misunderstood. As her emotional distress worsens, she begins to hallucinate women trapped behind the yellow wallpaper, mirroring her own descent into madness. Think of Bertha Mason in Jane Eyre, locked away not just for violence, but for deviating too far from the ideal of femininity. These characters often served as cautionary symbols, reinforcing the belief that emotional women were unstable and that their instability must be contained. Few distinctions were made. If a woman's behavior could not be neatly managed within the home, she was often sent away for treatment. What grief, what violence, and what longing were misunderstood as disease. There, she witnessed women locked in cells, tied to beds, and fed bland food in silence. Studies consistently show that women's reports of pain are taken less seriously than men's. When women cry in hospitals, they're comforted. When men cry, they're examined. Yet that same society mistrusted their emotions, ridiculed their intellect, and institutionalized their unhappiness. A woman was expected to be graceful, maternal, and passive, and if she failed in any of these areas, something must be wrong with her body. Most had not been violent. Many were simply inconvenient to opinionated, to melancholic, or too difficult. A woman who went to her doctor complaining of chronic fatigue, numbness, nightmares, or sexual discomfort might be told she was hysterical. Her uterus, they claimed, was inflamed, displaced, or overactive. The recommended treatment: purgatives, electrostimulation, genital massage, or, in more extreme cases, surgery. When Elizabeth was finally released, she published an account of her experience, sparking public outrage and eventually prompting legal reforms in some states. Take, for example, the case of Elizabeth Packard, an American woman institutionalized by her husband in 1860. Her offense: Elizabeth spent years confined to the Jacksonville Insane Asylum in Illinois, but she was the exception. Even outside asylums, hysteria influenced nearly every aspect of women's health care. This was the age of the gynecological cure, a school of thought pioneered by surgeons like J. Marion Sims, often called the father of modern gynecology. The logic was chillingly simple. If the uterus caused a problem, remove it, or cut the nerves, or quiet the body by force. And yet, at the same time, women's hysteria was also commercialized. Pharmaceutical companies began producing tinctures and tonics aimed at nervous ladies. The contradictions of this era are stark. Victorian society placed women on a pedestal, declaring them the moral backbone of the household. Art and literature of the time reflected this anxiety. In novels, the madwoman in the attic became a recurring figure, tragic, dangerous, and ultimately. But not all women went quietly. Some began to question the diagnosis. The story was not just fiction. It was a protest, a quiet scream against the very real medical practices that robbed women of agency and dignity. And yet, even into the early 20th century, hysteria continued to evolve rather than disappear. One could argue that hysteria never truly left it, just changed names. Today, many women still encounter medical dismissal. They are told their pain is exaggerated, their symptoms are just stress, or that their anxiety is hormonal. The ghost of hysteria still lingers, and so we are left to consider, in diagnosing women's suffering as madness, what truths were erased. If, instead of removing wombs, physicians had asked better questions about marriage, abuse, depression, or hope, how many women might have been saved? As the Victorian era gave way to the 20th century, the grip of hysteria as a medical diagnosis began to loosen, but only slightly. The name itself started to fade from official records, replaced by more modern terms like conversion disorder or psychogenic illness. And yet, the spirit of the diagnosis, its assumptions, its mistrust of female emotion, deeply embedded in medical and cultural attitudes. While this was a step forward in some ways, it moved hysteria from the pelvis to the psyche, also introduced a new kind of control. Part of this persistence came from how effectively hysteria had been used to explain away female pain. The symptoms were real, after all. The fainting, the exhaustion, the tremors, the overwhelming anxiety. These things happened. Women were still routinely prescribed sedatives and tranquilizers for anxiety, depression, or fatigue. These were handed out liberally, often without a thorough diagnostic process. The most iconic example of this trend was the rise of Valium in the 1950s and 60s, marketed as a cure for nervous housewives. But instead of being understood as responses to trauma, stress, or societal oppression, they were consistently interpreted through biological blame. Instead of investigating social factors, like the restrictive expectations placed on wives, and mothers, medical culture turned again to the chemical solution: calm the nerves, quiet the mind, make the symptoms disappear. Others suggested it would relieve chronic fatigue or nervous irritability. Friedan argued that this so-called problem that has no name was not a personal failing. It was the product of a society that limited women as choices, silenced their ambitions, and ignored their complexity. They revealed how many women had been sterilized, over-medicated, or institutionalized without true consent. They demanded that women be heard, believed, and trusted with their own bodies. In truth, many of these procedures were unnecessary, but they were rarely questioned. But in placing the blame on unconscious fantasy or internal conflict, Freud and his followers often invalidated women's real experiences, including abuse, social isolation, and systemic inequality. Conditions like endometriosis, chronic fatigue syndrome, or fibromyalgia disorders that disproportionately affect women are still misdiagnosed, or dismissed as psychological. In its place, more specific categories emerged: somatoform form disorders, dissociative disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, and borderline personality disorder. The old story of the woman not believed, not understood, not treated is still playing out. Some of these diagnoses remain controversial, but they reflected a growing recognition that women's mental health required nuance, and though Freud eventually acknowledged that men could suffer from hysteria too, the stigma remained powerfully gendered. If a woman protested too much, perhaps she had an unresolved Oedipus complex. If she withdrew, perhaps she had secret guilt. No matter the symptom, the cause was presumed to be inside her, not outside. The woman's reproductive system, her hormones, or simply her female nature were assumed to be the root cause. Mental health advocacy has grown louder, broader, and more inclusive. Voices that were once silenced on fainting couches are now speaking out in clinics, in classrooms, and on social media. A historical instinct to say, it's all in her head, when the truth is far more complicated. Writers, activists, and academics pushed back against the pathologizing of female emotion. They asked why women's distress was so often blamed on hormones, hysteria, or internal flaws rather than being seen as legitimate responses to external oppression. The early 20th century brought the rise of psychoanalysis, led by Sigmund Freud, who began to reinterpret hysteria not as a condition of the uterus, but as a mental conflict often sexual in origin. Freud believed that hysteria resulted from repressed desires, often centered around sexuality, childhood trauma, or unfulfilled emotional needs. This psychoanalytic framework shaped Western psychiatry for decades. Women's complaints continued to be interpreted through a lens of hyperemotion, sexuality, and fragility. Meanwhile, medical practices retained much of their Victorian flavor well into the 20th century. Doctors wrote millions of prescriptions for women who were exhausted, discontent, and overwhelmed. And if the pills didn't work, the surgical option remained. Even in the mid-1900s, hysterectomies were still performed for vague or poorly understood female complaints. Some doctors believed removing the uterus could alleviate psychological symptoms. The connection between female biology and emotional instability had become so deeply normalized that removing reproductive organs was considered a valid form of psychiatric treatment. But then, something began to change. In the 1960s and 70s, as second-wave feminism emerged, women began to challenge the structures that had long medicalized their suffering. Books like The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan exposed the deep dissatisfaction many women felt in their roles as wives and mothers. At the same time, medical feminists like Barbara Seaman and Germaine Greer began exposing the abuses of gynecology and psychiatry. Slowly, the discourse began to shift. The term hysteria was formally removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 1980. And yet, the ghosts of hysteria still linger. To this day, women are more likely than men to be diagnosed with mood or anxiety disorders, and less likely to be believed when reporting symptoms of pain or distress. Women of color, disabled women, and LGBTQ+ individuals often face even greater medical neglect. Their symptoms filtered through intersecting biases, and perhaps this is the true legacy of hysteria. Not just a defunct diagnosis, but a pattern of dismissal. But the narrative is shifting. More women are entering the medical profession, More research is being conducted on female-centered health, and yet we must remember where it all began. With a wandering womb, with trembling hands, with a woman who cried and was told she must be cut open to make it stop. So the next time a woman says, "I'm not okay," what would history have us do? And more importantly, what will we choose to do instead? There is a peculiar kind of quiet that settles over a woman confined to a darkened room, stripped of her books, her pen, her conversation, and her walking shoes. A stillness not born of peace, but of forced passivity. It was a vaguely defined condition, said to result from the mental strain of modern life. Symptoms included fatigue, anxiety, insomnia, poor appetite, and feelings of hopelessness. She was to lie in bed around the clock, forbidden from standing, walking, reading, writing, or engaging in conversation. The patient was often spoon-fed, bathed like a child, and weighed regularly to ensure weight gain. Women, they claimed, were especially prone to and their recovery required a return to simplicity, stillness, and absolute dependence. She was instructed not to speak unless spoken to. Any resistance was labeled as part of her illness. Already suffering from depression or anxiety, they were now cut off from every support system, deprived of creative outlets, and infantilized under the guise of care. The room was dim. Stimulation was discouraged. Mental activity was considered dangerous. As the days into weeks, she begins to hallucinate, imagining a woman trapped behind the sickly yellow wallpaper of her bedroom. The story is a thinly veiled critique of the rest Quran, a harrowing account of how quickly a mind can unravel when denied expression. Women from New York to London were placed on the rest cure, some in private homes, others in hospital wards. The practice was exported to Europe, adopted by leading physicians, and written about in medical journals with reverent praise. Following months of enforced idleness, Gilman wrote a short story that would echo through literary history. The yellow wallpaper. Even knitting or light sewing could be seen as taxing. In some cases, women were not allowed to see their children during treatment. Others were forbidden from speaking to their husbands. Many were discouraged from expressing opinions at all. If they cried, they were sedated. If they protested, they were told their condition was worsening. When she gained weight, she said thank you and no longer mentioned her sorrow. Then and only then she might be deemed cured. In truth, it was a catch-all diagnosis, especially for women whose lives seemed outwardly stable, but who privately felt stifled, overwhelmed, or deeply unwell. It masked the emotional consequences of isolation, grief, postpartum pain, or unfulfilling marriages behind a language of medical authority. Some were re-diagnosed as insane and sent to asylums. In a few tragic cases, women took their own lives. One woman, after months on the rest cure, wrote that she no longer felt like herself. "The stillness has settled in my bones," she said. Another reported that after the treatment, she could no longer enjoy reading or music. She had lost her capacity for joy. Women who had been artists, teachers, writers, and mothers were reduced to patients in bed, waiting to be declared well enough to resume a life they had never chosen. In a letter years later, she wrote, "The treatment nearly drove me mad." She eventually fled the profession and returned to writing, later becoming a leading feminist voice. But many other women lacked the resources or the will to resist. That her absence from conversation, from creation, from society, was seen as a sign of health. This was the essence of the rest cure. A once widely prescribed treatment for women diagnosed with nervous exhaustion, hysteria, or simply too much emotion. His answer was simple, severe, and chillingly popular. Complete physical and intellectual rest. In the late 19th century, as industrialization and urban life surged, physicians grew increasingly concerned with a new and fashionable affliction, neurasthenia, or nervous collapse. Women who read too much, wrote too freely, or questioned domestic roles were seen as unstable. Physicians, almost all male, defended it fiercely. To them, the issue was not the treatment, but the patient's resistance. If she didn't get better, it was because she hadn't submitted fully. It was her fault, her weakness, their minds overstimulated by books and politics, had to be silenced. Entered Dr. Silas Mitchell, a prominent American neurologist who rose to fame for his method of curing this female affliction. So the cure for hysteria became the erasure of thought itself. The rest cure required the patient to be isolated from family and friends, often for 6 to 8 weeks or longer. Meals were delivered on trays. Nurses usually hired by the doctor, not chosen by the woman, oversaw every movement. The theory, according to Mitchell and his followers, was that the female nervous system was delicate, liable to collapse under too much intellectual strain. It is difficult to overstate just how punitive this treatment could feel. For many women, the rest cure was not coming, it was terrifying. One of the most famous reactions to the rest cure came from writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who underwent Mitchell's treatment in the 1880s after suffering postpartum depression. In it, a nameless woman is confined to a room by her physician, who's been told to rest and avoid all stimulation. Gilman's own words about her experience are sobering. Dr. Mitchell's treatment gained wide acclaim. His patients included the famous and the wealthy, and yet the cure had little basis in science. It was rooted instead in social ideology, particularly the belief that women's intellectual pursuits and emotional needs were inherently dangerous. Some doctors went even further, insisting that reading and writing caused uterine congestion, which in turn led to hysteria. This erasure had many forms. Over time, the rest cure became not a path to healing but a tool of suppression. And what did well enough mean? In many cases, compliance. When the patient stopped resisting, when she no longer asked to write, when she stopped arguing with her nurse. But the scars remained. Letters from former patients described the experience in quietly devastating terms. Still others experienced psychological breakdowns during or after treatment. Without stimulation, their minds turned inward, spinning fear and sadness into hallucination or obsession. And yet, even as these outcomes became known, the rest cure was rarely questioned. It is a haunting thought that silence was prescribed as medicine, that a woman's quiet was treated as proof of her recovery. So we're left to wonder, what if rest had meant something different? What if it had included compassion, connection, and gentle activity? What if the rest had included listen not just to the doctor, but to the woman herself? By the early 20th century, the rest cure had become deeply ingrained in Western medicine, not just as a treatment, but as a philosophy about what women needed. And what they needed, doctors insisted, was less stimulation, less activity, less independence. They needed to lie still and surrender. This ideology dovetailed perfectly with the social expectations of the time. In both Europe and the United States, middle and upper class women were expected to live quiet, domestic lives. They were to marry, bear children, run the home with grace, and avoid intellectual excess. It promised results without confrontation. A woman who had become difficult could be sent away for a few weeks, placed under strict control, and returned hopefully quieter and more compliant. Others were college-educated women who, having tasted intellectual freedom, struggled to return to the narrow path expected of them. A few had suffered abuse or loss, but lacked any vocabulary or safe space to process their grief. Letters from her were censored or discarded. Friends were discouraged from visiting. The idea was to prevent Others lost interest in everything, including recovery. A few entered states of near. Doctors sometimes interpreted these regressions as proof of how deeply the illness had rooted itself, but it was more likely the result of sensory deprivation, emotional neglect, and the erosion of personal identity. But in practice, this isolation often led to a sharp worsening of mental health. But even in its mildest forms, the treatment was based on the premise that the woman must be corrected, not understood. For those who struggled to conform, who longed for education, creative pursuits, or emotional connection, the result was often inner turmoil. A woman confined to bed might become sluggish, dependent, and emotionally withdrawn, not because of her original symptoms, but because the treatment itself stripped her of autonomy and purpose. One publication claimed that idle nerves are like idle hands prone to mischief, while another declared that stillness purifies the soul as it calms the flesh. First, published in 1892, the story was reprinted multiple times in the early 20th century. Films and novels portrayed her as tragic, angelic, or comically new models of psychiatry, especially those influenced by Freud, emphasized talking, analysis, and uncovering subconscious conflict. Still, the core ideas of the rest cure that women's emotional distress was best treated through control, silence, and stillness had already shaped generations of thought, but few challenged the idea that her condition was a problem to be solved with less living. When a teenager with anxiety is told she's too sensitive, when a patient seeking help is told to stop thinking so much and focus on wellness, not what's wrong, these are modern reflections of an old pattern. Minimize, isolate, quiet, down. Feminist critics began to use it as a symbol of resistance against medical and societal silencing. The trapped woman behind the wallpaper became a metaphor for the millions of women whose suffering had been misdiagnosed as disobedience. This language reveals just how intertwined the cure was with moral judgment. Rest wasn't just physical, it was spiritual discipline. They told doctors they felt numb, hopeless, and empty, but in most cases, the diagnosis came quickly. Neurasthenia, or hysteria. They pointed out that the treatment seemed to work best when patients were already submissive and failed when they had ideas, questions, or ambition. She conducted experiments, measuring strength and stamina in women before and after menstruation, debunking the widely held belief that women needed to rest during their cycles. Her research, though groundbreaking, was slow to be accepted. But when they expressed this turmoil, through anxiety, insomnia, weeping, or defiance, they weren't met with empathy. They were sent to bed. The rest cure gained even more popularity in the decades following its invention, thanks in part to its appeal to male doctors and family members. In this sense, the rest cure was not just a treatment, it was a form of social correction. Many rest cure patients were young women experiencing their first emotional crisis. Some were newlyweds who found marriage more confining than they'd imagined, and so they stopped eating, or cried uncontrollably, or complained of strange sensations. From there, the prescription was standardized: isolation, immobilization, obedience. The physician would often instruct family members to ignore the woman's complaints. Some women, once sociable and active, began to speak in whispers. The psychological impact of the rest cure was profound. In a chilling twist, the very conditions meant to heal women sometimes made them fit the diagnosis more completely. Yet the rest cure persisted. Medical journals in the late 19th and early 20th centuries continued to praise it. Of course, not all doctors applied the rest cure with equal severity. Some allowed for gentle walks, occasional visits, or supervised reading. And the voices of protest, though few, did begin to rise. By the early 1900s, female physicians and mental health advocates began to publicly question the rest cure. Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby, one of the first female physicians in the United States, published a study showing that women's nervous systems were not inherently weaker than men's. In literature, the yellow wallpaper continued to gain traction. Meanwhile, in popular culture, the image of the fragile woman in bed, the fainting lady, the nervous bride, the overburdened mother, became both romanticized and ridiculed. By the 1920s and 30s, the rest cure began to lose favor among mainstream physicians. Even today, echoes of the rest cure remain. When a woman with postpartum depression is told to just get some rest, and so we must ask, what would have happened if, instead of being sent to bed, women had been asked what they needed? What did they fear? What did they hope for? What might healing have looked like if it began with listening rather than silencing? Would you like to continue to section 3 of story 5? The rest cure: how silence became a prescription. As the 20th century progressed, the rest cure quietly faded from medical textbooks and clinical practice, but its legacy did not. The philosophy behind it, the belief that a woman's distress should be managed through stillness, restriction, and silence, lingered long after the prescription was withdrawn. What was left in its wake was not just a generation of women who had been confined and condescended to, but a deep-seated cultural reflex. When women express pain, the instinct is often to quiet them, and it had a certain symmetry. remove stress, enforce rest, and rebuild strength. But in reality, it was used as a tool of containment, not understanding. The rest cure began with the promise of healing. To a physician like Silas Weir Mitchell, it was the scientific answer to a growing mental health crisis. For many women, it simply reinforced what society already told them. Don't talk too much. Don't move too much. Don't want too much. Male distress was seen as temporary, fixable through will and movement. Female distress was seen as chronic, rooted in biology, and best managed by others. If she spoke too much, she was overwrought. If she resisted her treatment, if she got worse, it only proved she needed more rest. The same symptoms that led to rest cures in the 1880s now led to electric shock therapy, tranquilizers, or long-term commitment. The methods changed. The assumptions didn't. Even the structure of care was telling. Male patients were sent out into the world, while female patients were sent away from it. Others followed women, who chronicled their time in institutions, their battles with doctors, and their fight to be seen as whole people, not symptoms in need of stillness. In these texts, the rest cure is remembered not as mercy, but as erasure, the slow fading of self under the guise of care. The problem was how it was enforced, without listening, without consent, without curiosity about the woman's lived experience. The rest cure did not ask what a woman needed. It decided for her. A Greytan who had a nervous spell and was sent away for a while. A grandmother who stayed in bed for months and came back different. When a woman's voice quivers in a meeting, she may be told to calm down. When a new mother says she's overwhelmed, she may be told to nap when the baby naps. When a teenage girl grows withdrawn or anxious, she may be told to unplug, to rest when what she may need is someone to ask her, what hurts? These quiet, vague histories point to a past where women's breakdowns were not spoken of, only managed. It is a window into how a society can fail to see emotional pain as real pain, especially when it lives in women. And above, don't resist. It's worth noting that the rest cure was rarely applied to men in the same way. Male patients diagnosed with neurasthenia were more likely to be prescribed travel, exercise, and adventure. What was called the West Cure. She is invited to walk in nature, to speak about her fears, to write her thoughts down, and to cry without judgment. She is supported, not erased. For them, recovery meant action and autonomy. For women, recovery meant immobility. This gendered split reflects the deeper values at play. Freud's theories on hysteria were born from patients like Anna O, but his interpretation frequently favored internal sexual conflict over external reality. Abuse, grief, and powerlessness were minimized or reinterpreted. The woman in pain was still a puzzle to be solved, not a voice to be heard. This divergence shaped the course of modern psychiatry. While psychoanalysis and early psychological theories evolved in the early 20th century, they often carried forward the biases and blind spots of the Victorian era. In this context, the rest cure became less a treatment and more a template for how to respond to women as suffering. Simplify, silence, and sideline. Even decades later, these ideas shaped policy. Mid-century America, for example, saw a resurgence of psychiatric hospitalization for women, especially housewives, who reported anxiety, fatigue, or dissatisfaction. And for many, the memory of the rest cure became part of family lore. But some women wrote their way out. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper is just one example. And still, rest itself is not the enemy. Rest can be radical. It can be healing, loving, and nourishing. The problem was, never rest. Imagine, instead, a different version. A woman shows signs of emotional exhaustion. She is offered time off, but also companionship. That, too, is rest. But it was never the rest cure. Today, we carry echoes of these ideas into the present. The story of the rest cure, then, is not just a medical history. And so we ask, how many stories were lost to silence? How many voices went unheard because they were told to lie down and be still? And what might happen, finally, if we choose to stop prescribing silence and start listening instead. By the time the 1950s arrived, Western medicine had begun to shed the more archaic trappings of hysteria, fainting couches, and enforced bed, but the unease surrounding women's emotions had not gone away, and at the center of this carefully polished domestic stage stood the housewife, neat, smiling, and efficient. She had everything she was supposed to want: a husband, children, appliances that gleamed, and an entire culture telling her she was living the dream. They couldn't sleep. They were irritable, exhausted, and prone to crying without cause. Some experienced panic attack. But in the 1950s, there was little public language to describe these states, especially not for women. The idea that a white, middle-class housewife might be suffering mentally was nearly taboo. Others withdrew completely, going through the motions with a numb smile. It had simply put on a new face, one powdered with talc, framed in a crisp apron, and seated dutifully in a pastel-colored kitchen. This was the age of the nuclear family, of suburban lawns, casserole, dishes, and well-behaved children. But many women in the post-war period, particularly in America, felt a gnawing hollowness beneath the surface. Her home was safe. Chief among these was Milltown, released in 1955, and later, which became a cultural symbol in its own right. They just took the edge off allowing women to maintain their routines without breaking down. Her children were healthy. What does she have to be sad about? They described it in vague terms. A heaviness, a feeling of being trapped, a sense that something was missing. Today, we would likely recognize these symptoms as classic signs of depression, anxiety disorders, or post-traumatic stress. A woman who felt stifled by her domestic role didn't need Liberation. She needed 10 milligrams twice daily. By the late 1960s, Valium was the most prescribed drug in America. Women, by far, were the primary consumers. The average housewife might go days without meaningful adult interaction. Her responsibilities were endless, her rest minimal, and her ambitions, if she had any, were quietly discouraged. A mother who cried after putting the kids to bed, wasn't he? Suffering from isolation, she was just a little nervous. A wife who flinched at her husband as touch, wasn't he? Grappling with trauma, she had female tension. Some reported feeling emotionally blunted, disconnected from their children or spouses. Others found themselves needing higher doses just to feel functional. A few pioneering psychiatrists and social workers began to speak out, suggesting that perhaps the problem wasn't in the patient, but in her environment. But their voices were drowned out by the tidal wave of pharmaceutical advertising, which promised a pill for every discomfort. A few, especially those mixing pills with alcohol, fell into dangerous cycles of addiction, all while maintaining the facade of cheerful homemaking. After all, she was supposed to be grateful. Her husband had returned from war, and while this framework was a step forward in some ways, it moved away from the moralizing of the past. It also reduced women's emotional experiences to brain chemistry, ignoring the social and cultural forces bearing down on them. Divorce was still heavily discouraged and economically punishing. Few women had independent incomes or property rights. There were no legal protections against marital rape, no mainstream conversations about postpartum depression, and little awareness of how trauma might play out over years. This conflict between the public image of contentment and the private reality of unease was quietly consuming the inner lives of countless women. And once again, medicine stepped in, but not to listen, not to ask. She interviewed women across America who described waking up in the morning. Others rebelled quietly through alcohol, secret diaries, or late-night sobbing in the laundry room. A few began to write, to protest, to organize, and dreading the day, not because it was filled with danger or chaos, but because it was so endlessly, numbly predictable. To prescribe, this was the dawn of the tranquilizer era. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, American pharmaceutical companies launched an unprecedented campaign to promote anti-anxiety medications specifically targeted toward women. These drugs were marketed as simple, safe, and modern. They didn't require talk therapy. They didn't involve messy hospital stays. Magazine ads painted an alluring picture. A young woman, lips curled into a soft smile, looks peacefully out a window. The tagline reads, "Your doctor knows how to help you feel like yourself again." What went unspoken was the underlying assumption that yourself meant calm, functional, and most importantly, tranquilizers fit perfectly into the cultural moment. They allowed society to treat symptoms without examining causes. Doctors handed out prescriptions with alarming ease. Between 1955 and 1960, Milltown became the first drug to reach $1 billion in sales. The medical rationale for these prescriptions was based on emerging psychiatric models, which framed anxiety as a biochemical imbalance. There was little conversation about the mental toll of housework, the isolation of suburban life, the lack of creative or professional outlets, or the long-term effects of gendered expectations. Betty Friedan, in her landmark 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, famously called this malaise the problem that has no name. These women weren't crazy. They were suffocating, and tranquilizers made it easier to endure the suffocation. In private, many women grew dependent on these pills. The line between medication and sedation blurred. Yet doctors continued to prescribe. There were exceptions. Of course, medical professionals who saw the underlying issues. What these ads never mentioned was that many of the women they targeted had no alternative. Therapy was expensive, stigmatized, and often inaccessible. So the pills kept coming, and the silence deepened. Some women, desperate for meaning, threw themselves into perfectionism, becoming the ultimate homemaker, crafting the ideal image for neighbors and guests. But most just survived. And we must ask, what would have happened if, instead of tranquilizers, they had been offered questions? What if their pain had been recognized, not as a disorder, but as a reasonable response to unreasonable expectations? Would they have still needed the pills, or would they have needed, for the first time, to be heard? The 1950s housewife, though polished on the surface, carried the weight of unspoken burdens. Her day began early, long before the family rose, packing lunches, preparing breakfast, ironing shirts, and bathing children. Her tasks were endless, and all the while, she was expected to keep her voice soft, her mood light, and her hair brushed. They were taught to view female nervousness as a chemical imbalance or a biological fragility. When a woman wept in his office, a doctor might not ask about her marriage, her sleep, her fears, or her loneliness. Instead, he reached for his prescription pad. It was into this setting that tranquilizers slipped quietly, almost elegantly, like powdered sugar over a bitter cake. Doctors, influenced by both pharmaceutical marketing and prevailing social narratives, truly believed they were helping. The result, a culture of medical compliance without reflection. Women who felt unwell were told that relief came in a tablet, not in discussion. And that, in many ways, was the point. Nicknamed Mother's Little Helper, the drug was lauded for its ability to soothe frazzled nerves and make housework feel bearable. Pillboxes were tucked into purses alongside lipstick and tissue. Women passed them to one another like breath mints, whispering, "These really take the edge off." And for some, they did that at least temporarily. Advertisements rarely acknowledged mental illness outright. Instead, they painted anxiety as an inconvenience, a wrinkle in the otherwise smooth surface of a happy home. A brief lapse in gratitude. A rough patch in the perfect life. Doctors didn't probe the nature of the distress, they simply numbed it. But the pills were never just pills. For many, these tranquilizers were the only form of psychological care they ever received. Therapy was expensive and stigmatized, especially in suburban or conservative communities. Admitting to depression or anxiety was often seen as a moral failing. Better to take the pill quietly. Better not to say anything at all. It became a symbol of contained emotion, of a society uncomfortable with female complexity. They cooked dinner, smiled at PTA meetings, and kissed their husbands goodnight. But under the surface, the same unrest that had haunted Victorian women, though, now covered in pastel tones and pharmaceutical polish. Valium, in particular, exploded in popularity. Why feel tense? asked one ad over a photo of a woman folding laundry. Your doctor has something that can help. The feminist rhetoric of freedom and independence didn't always reach the quiet streets of suburbia, where women woke every day with leaden limbs and foggy minds. But help for whom? Valium didn't make the laundry lighter or the screaming toddlers quieter. What it did was make the woman quieter. By the early 1970s, millions of women were taking tranquilizers daily. Some began relying on them just to get through the morning. The pharmaceutical industry had little incentive to challenge a profitable system, and the idea that a woman's distress was her own biochemical inconvenience remained deeply embedded in cultural thinking. But dependence grew, and not just in secret. Activists began to link mental health with social structure, arguing that women were not sick but silenced. Others mixed them with alcohol intentionally or accidentally, leading to overdoses. Some favored the demand wasn't just for better pills, but for better lives with autonomy, purpose, and community. Saying you were chemically imbalanced was safer than saying you felt trapped in a marriage, in a gender role, or in a world that required you to smile, no matter how much you ached. In 1979, Rolling Stones frontman Mick Jagger famously sang about the epidemic. Mother needs something today to calm her down, and no, she's not really ill. There's a little yellow pill. That little yellow pill was and behind the lyrics was a very real epidemic of prescription drug use, primarily among women. In the private space of the home, women numbed themselves just enough to keep functioning. The problem, as Betty Friedan had warned, still had no name, and even as the women's liberation movement began to gain momentum, many housewives felt too exhausted, too medicated, or too isolated to join in. Still, some began to speak up. In women's magazines, letters to the editor began appearing. I take my pill in the morning and float through the day. I want what I have, but something's missing. The doctor says, it's just my nerves. But I think it's something else. These weren't cries for help, they were whispers of awakening. In time, these voices grew louder, but changing a system built on obedience was never going to be quick. Even as awareness grew, doctors were slow to revise their approach. So, tranquilizers kept flowing, even as consequences became harder to ignore. Women began reporting memory problems, dulled emotion, and dependency. Some struggled to stop using the drugs, experiencing withdrawal symptoms when they tried. And still, many remained silent, because saying you needed pills was easier than saying you were angry. These women weren't hysterical. They weren't weak. They were, in many cases, the quiet casualties of societal expectation. So the question lingers. What if their lives had offered support instead of sedation? What if, instead of being told to take a pill and carry on, someone had asked, what do you want to do with your life? What's exhausting you? Who listens to you? What makes you feel alive? And what would our world look like if we had answered those questions? Not with a prescription, but with compassion. As the 1960s melted into the 1970s, the polished surface of suburban domesticity began to crack. Feminist writers, civil rights leaders, and countercultural voices all pushed society to examine what had been hidden beneath the quiet hand. Among the most urgent questions was this: why were so many women so unwell beneath the steady hum of washing machines and the clink of cocktail glasses at backyard barbecues? A generation of women had been medicated into submission. The answer, as it turned out, had less to do with faulty brain chemistry and more to do with the emotional and social architecture of post-war life. Valium smoothed the edges. It dulled the dread. It made the days blur together a little more softly, but it never solved anything. The drug was so common that it became a kind of cultural shorthand. Something you took before company came over, or after the baby cried all night, or when the emptiness of the day became too heavy to bear. It was whispered about in kitchens and at church, handed over like breath mints. Here, one woman might say to another, this helps. By 1970, Valium had become the most prescribed drug in the United States, with millions of users, primarily women. And for some, it did help, at least briefly, because the real problems weren't chemical, they were existential. Women in the 1950s and 60s were raised on the dream of the perfect home, the devoted husband, the sweet children, and the sense of having it all. But what they weren't prepared for was the crushing silence of isolated motherhood, the boredom of endless housework, the absence of recognition, the loss of ambition, and the lack of options. Her work echoed across a generation of feminists who demanded better care, more options, and a rethinking of what it meant for a woman to be well. When they expressed distress, they were told she had fury, grief, and clarity, that their sadness was a personal flaw, not a reflection of the limited world they'd been handed. Novels, plays, and memoirs surfaced, detailing the intimate anguish of women who had been told they were crazy for not being satisfied with dusting the mantle. Jello molds. You should be grateful. But by then, a legacy had been written. You have a good life. SSRs, mood stabilizers, and sleep aids. These are legitimate and often life-saving tools, but too often they are still prescribed without asking what lies beneath. It's probably your hormones. Here's something to help you relax. It left behind a profound cultural silencer. Silence still echoing in modern medicine today. And so they swallowed the pills, smiled, and continued, but not all of them. Activists continued to demand better access to therapy, less gender bias in diagnosis, and more research into female-centered conditions. And younger generations are more likely to ask why they feel anxious, or not just how to stop it. A growing number began to push back. Pamphlets and essays pointed to the pharmaceutical industry's predatory advertising tactics, to the complicity of male doctors, and to the cultural pressure to medicate dissatisfaction rather than address it. Women's liberation groups in the late 60s and 70s began to spotlight the issue of over-medication. In 1979, Barbara Seaman, a journalist and women's health advocate, published Women in the Crisis in Sex Hormones, exposing the dangers of overprescribing medications like tranquilizers, hormone pills, and sedatives without informed consent. In literature and pop culture, the narrative began to shift. No longer was the pill-popping housewife a background character. She was the center. She had a voice. By the 1980s, tranquilizer prescriptions for women began to decline, due in part to public backlash, increased awareness of dependence, and evolving medical standards. A generation of women had been told, implicitly and explicitly, that their suffering was chemical, not circumstantial, that their distress was dysfunction. Even worse, many were told they were the lucky one. And so, as the era faded, it left behind more than pill bottles, because while tranquilizers have largely fallen out of fashion, their spirit survives in new forms. Is the woman anxious because she's chemically imbalanced, or is she overwhelmed by the demands placed on her from work, home, and family? Is she depressed because her neurotransmitters are misfiring, or is she carrying generations of inherited silence? Modern medicine, for all its advances, still struggles to ask those deeper questions, and society still subtly rewards women who suppress their pain with pills rather than words. But some things have changed. Women today speak more freely about mental health. Social media, for all its flaws, offers platforms for shared stories. The term "mother's little helper" has become more ironic than reverent. Still, the shadows remain. There are still women crying quietly in bathrooms, wondering if their sadness is valid. There are still doctors who write prescriptions before asking about marriages, finances, or fear. And there are still glossy magazines whispering that serenity can be bought in bottles. So the story continues not just of tranquilizers, but of what happens when a society defines female emotional pain as a problem to be treated quietly, instead of a signal to be understood deeply. And so, we ask once more, what if those women in 1957, tired, lonely, what if the problem had never been them, but the cage they were asked to decorate? By the dawn of the 20th century, the word hysteria had become worn out. Its use to broad, its reputation too tangled in superstition and misogyny. It had carried women through centuries of misunderstanding, from the wandering womb of ancient Greece to the fainting couches of Victorian parlors. But in medical offices, clinics, and textbooks, the language was beginning to shift. Not because the impulse to pathologize women's emotions had vanished. Mental illness was being renamed, sorted, and categorized into diagnostic handbooks. Terms like depression, anxiety, psychosis, borderline conversion disorder, and bipolar slowly replaced the old umbrella of female nervous disease. But because the packaging had changed, the 20th century brought psychiatry into the modern age. New frameworks emerged: Freudian psychoanalysis, behavior, and neurobiologies, promising more scientific ways to understand the mind. But even with these new classifications, the gendered lens remained. If a man experienced rage, it was seen as externalized conflict. If a woman did, it was instability. If a man drank to numb emotion, it was tragic. Their symptoms, while disruptive, were often coping mechanisms formed in response to deep, unresolved pain, characterized by emotional volatility, fear of abandonment, impulsivity, and identity disturbance. BPD became one of the most frequently diagnosed conditions among women. Up to 75% of cases. By some estimates, many were dismissed entirely, told their emotions were too intense, too messy, too feminine. Women diagnosed with BPD were seen as manipulative, attention-seeking, or emotionally immature. In some psychiatric circles, they were labeled as difficult patients, resistant to treatment, prone to crises, and unlikely to improve. If a woman did, it was shameful. Even now, diagnostic categories developed during this era continue to reflect implicit bias about how men and women are supposed to express distress. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, first published in 1952 by the American Psychiatric Association, became the gold standard of psychiatric diagnoses in the U.S. It was meant to bring consistency and clarity to a field once dominated by speculation, and it did, at least superficially, but its pages still reflected the assumptions of the time. A person navigating racism, homophobia, or economic hardship. Take the case of borderline personality disorder, first recognized in the DSM-3 in 1980. When it finally appeared, it was met with skepticism from some male psychiatrists who feared it would medicalize female emotion. But in reality, it offered validation for women who had long been told they were imagining their symptoms. For decades, BPD carried a stigma not just of mental illness, but of bad behavior. When women described their experiences, they were often told it was all in their heads. Easier to write a prescription, easier to say it's her brain chemistry, easier to declare her chemically depressed than emotionally unhurt. Yet many of these women were survivors of childhood trauma, emotional neglect, or abuse. But instead of compassion, they were given labels. Some were institutionalized, others were prescribed heavy sedatives, or subjected to behavioral conditioning. The psychiatric culture of the 20th century struggled to separate de-stress from deviance, especially in women. Even the diagnosis of depression, which gained legitimacy through pharmacological research in the 1950s and 60s, was often reduced to a script. The woman feels sad, the doctor prescribes medication. The tendency to view women's emotions as excessive or pathological remained deeply rooted in clinical language, treatment plans, and even research funding. Case closed. Meanwhile, male patients reporting the same symptoms are more likely to be asked about stressors' external causes, not just internal chemistry. Little effort was made to explore the context. Was she a single mother with no support? A woman in an abusive relationship? To explore those things would require acknowledging that her pain wasn't always internal. It was relational, structural, and political. But such conversations made medicine uncomfortable. This tendency extended into other corners of psychiatry as well. The diagnosis of premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which recognizes severe psychological symptoms tied to the menstrual cycle, took decades to be included in the DSM. Despite centuries of women describing extreme monthly mood shifts, meanwhile, conditions that disproportionately affect women like chronic fatigue syndrome, autoimmune diseases with psychiatric overlap, and eating disorders continued to face skepticism in the most literal sense. Mental illness became a tool of counter, and especially for women who didn't fit the mold. Too angry, diagnosis. Too sexual, diagnosis. Too queer, diagnosis. Too ambitious, diagnosis. And within this framework, treatment often became compliance training. You will recover when you become calm, when you stop complaining, when you accept your limitations. But even within this system, some women began to push back. The rise of feminist psychology in the 1970s and 80s offered a radically different approach. Therapists like Carol Gilligan and Phyllis Chesler began to ask, what if a woman's breakdown was not proof of dysfunction but evidence that something around her was broken? What if rage, sadness, and panic weren't symptoms of mental illness, but reasonable reactions to impossible circumstances? What if mental health clearly listened to pain, to context, to story? These questions didn't overturn the field overnight, but they opened the door. Still, even as progress was made, mainstream psychiatry often resisted systemic critiques. Even today, female patients are more likely to be diagnosed with mood or anxiety disorders, and more likely to be offered medication before therapy. The names may have changed. The treatments may be more humane, but the impulse to doubt a woman's pain remains. So we ask, in this age of advanced diagnostics and cutting-edge neuroscience, have we truly moved beyond the shadows of hysteria? Or have we simply renamed the silence? In the decades following the mid-century explosion of psychiatric labeling, medicine continued to evolve. The 1980s and 1990s were an era of new medications, new manuals, and new hope, but also of old assumptions wrapped in modern terms. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, expanded with each edition, cataloging a growing list of disorders with increasing specificity. And for women, the list of things they could be diagnosed with expanded too, but rarely with the same empathy, precision, or curiosity offered to men. Women were now commonly diagnosed with major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, bipolar disorder, and personality disorders of several varieties. In some ways, this allowed for more targeted treatment. In others, it reinforced an enduring message. If a woman is distressed, the most likely explanation is that something is wrong with her. Not necessarily her situation, not her relationships, not her history. This assumption played out in countless psychiatric evaluations. A woman who grew up in a violent household and now struggles with trust and emotional regulation might be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Women who experience sexual violence, intimate partner abuse, or childhood neglect were often misdiagnosed with anxiety or depression alone. The trauma behind their symptoms went unrecognized. A mother with 4 children, no child care, financial stress, and constant fatigue might be told she had major depression. In some cases, this saves lives. In others, it delays healing. They show up to work, manage homes, and raise children. This is especially true for Black women, Latina women, and women of color who face additional stereotypes of aggression, drama, or resistance. Their symptoms are less likely to be seen as trauma responses and more likely to be interpreted as defiance, danger, or attitude. They smile in public and cry only when no one is watching. Their pain doesn't scream, it whispers. And modern psychiatry, still trained to listen for crisis, sometimes misses the soft voices. They rarely accounted for the subtle ways trauma manifests in women. People-pleasing, somatic symptoms, and dissociation. By the late 20th century, anorexia and bulimia were finally recognized as legitimate psychiatric conditions, but they were still often viewed through the lens of vanity, not pain. That mental illness isn't always an internal defect. That pain doesn't always look like a crisis. Or Izam Wong, who wrote The Collected Schizophrenias, exploring her own life with a complex diagnosis. Their work reminds us that even serious mental illness does not erase personhood. But the question remains, how much of what we call mental illness is simply a response to being unheard, unseen, and misunderstood. For generations, the women are not just case studies. They are thinkers, writers, daughters, and leaders. That recovery doesn't begin with a diagnosis but with dignity. Young women who starved themselves were treated with alarm, but also with a tinge of scorn. Why would someone do that to themselves? Instead, they focused on external behavior, and when that behavior didn't match expectations, it was labeled problematic. The ordinary response to atrocities is to banish them from consciousness. Her insight reframed women's symptoms as strategies of survival, not weakness. A teen girl with social anxiety and perfectionism could be labeled with OCD or an emerging mood disorder when all she really needed was rest, support, and safety. Implicit bias, the invisible lens through which we judge another's behavior, still guides far too many decisions in treatment, medication, and even hospital admissions. The tools used to assess women's mental health were often built by men for male presentations of illness. Take eating disorders, for example. Rarely was the question turned around: what has happened to this young woman that control over food has become her only expression of agency? Similarly, post-traumatic stress disorder, though well documented in war veterans by the 1980s, took longer to be fully understood in domestic contexts. Even now, research shows that women are more likely to be prescribed psychotropic medications and less likely to be referred for trauma-informed care, because sometimes what looks like modern madness is really just a normal response to unbearable things. The challenge is that many of these women are high-functioning. Those who do cry loudly or act out are often judged more harshly. A black woman with panic attacks may be told she's being over-emotional. A Latina teenager with depression may be labeled unstable. A Muslim woman suffering from PTSD after a hate crime may be told she is just stressed. Intersectional feminism and modern clinical psychology have begun to reckon with these blind spots, but progress is uneven. And yet, even with these flaws, many women have reclaimed their narratives through memoir, poetry, film, and advocacy. They've begun to tell the truth psychiatry often overlooks. Take the example of Ellen Sachs, a legal scholar diagnosed with schizophrenia, who went on to write a memoir and advocate for patient rights. Others have spoken out against misdiagnosis itself. The feminist psychiatrist Dr. Judith Herman, whose work on trauma transformed how clinicians understand survivors, famously said, "Today, the DSM continues to evolve. Trauma-informed care is expanding. More women are entering psychiatry and redefining its values. Perhaps the women of the 20th century weren't breaking down. Perhaps they were breaking out of roles that didn't fit, out of marriages that silenced them, out of expectations that demanded their emotional erasure. And when they were finally labeled, it wasn't because they had changed. It was because they had refused to pretend anymore." As the 20th century drew to a close, women's mental health remained at a crossroads, caught between a growing awareness of historical injustices and the lingering shadows of outdated medical beliefs. For decades, women had been diagnosed, dismissed, drugged, institutionalized, and told that their feelings were signs of internal failure. But by the 1990s and early 2000s, a subtle but profound shift had begun. More women were becoming therapists, and they were asking different questions. They weren't just cataloging symptoms. They were asking where those symptoms came from. Why were so many women being diagnosed with depression? Why did trauma manifest differently in girls than in boys? Why were female patients more likely to be told their pain was psychosomatic? Why did the psychiatric system continue to label the response but ignore the cause? These were not vague correlations. They were deeply rooted patterns. Instead of assuming that the woman was broken, feminist psychologists asked whether the world around her was breaking her. In academic journals and activist circles, this shift gave rise to the field of feminist psychology, an approach that prioritized context, social factors, and power dynamics in understanding mental illness. And the data supported their question. Studies showed that women who experienced early trauma, particularly sexual abuse, neglect, or coercive control, were significantly more likely to develop mental health conditions later in life. A woman with panic attacks wasn't Irrational, she may have spent her childhood waiting for the sound of her father's footsteps in the hallway. A woman with dissociation was anti-defective. She may have survived years of unspoken violence and learned how to disappear to survive. A woman with depression might not lack serotonin. She might lack validation, safety, or the right to rest. But even as this more nuanced understanding grew in the academy and some clinical settings, many women still encountered the same old assumptions in everyday medicine. It gave a woman the right to admit she was struggling. It justified her pain in the eyes of others. It made space for her to say, something is wrong. Emergency rooms told anxious women they were just stressed. Primary care doctors prescribed antidepressants without asking about trauma. Insurance companies favored quick medication over long-term therapy. And in some communities, especially among marginalized groups, mental health care remained entirely inaccessible. In these cases, a diagnosis, no matter how flawed, sometimes became a strange kind of permission slip. Women of color still face bias, misdiagnosis, and neglect in mental health settings. Transgender women often face both hostility and erasure in care systems not designed for them. And those living in poverty, isolated rural areas, or under patriarchal control may not even make it to the point of diagnosis. But it often came at a cost. Her sadness had to be medicalized before it could be acknowledged. Her pain had to be pathologized before it could be treated. And even now, in the 21st century, these patterns persist. Today, women are still more likely than men to be diagnosed with anxiety and mood disorders, and to receive psychiatric medication as a first line of treatment. Recovery doesn't always mean being symptom-free, but being seen and supported. They offer language for what was once unnameable. They validate what generations of women were told to ignore. Recovery that isn't about returning to normal, but about building a new kind of normal. One where a woman's mind is not treated as suspicious, unstable, or hysterical, but as human. So what does it mean to talk about modern madness? It means recognizing that madness is not just a malfunction of the brain. It is often a cry from the soul, shaped by the world around it. It means asking not just what's wrong with the patient, but what's happened to her. Not just how to treat the symptoms, but how to change the conditions that created them. Not just how to quiet the distress, but how to honor its message. And perhaps this is where modern psychiatry still struggles most, with the idea that pain can be valid, even when it's inconvenient. That emotion can be truthful, even when it disrupts the calm. That healing sometimes begins not in the clinic, but in the act of being believed. In recent years, voices have risen: writers, therapists, and survivors who speak not just of suffering, but of recovery. Books like The Body Keeps the Score, Crazy Like Us, and Trauma and Recovery have reached millions of readers. And in therapy rooms, classrooms, and online spaces, new conversations are taking root. A woman says, "I feel broken," and the therapist answers, "Let's talk about who tried to break you." A girl says, "I don't know why I feel this way," and someone responds, "You don't have to justify your pain to be worthy of care." A mother says, "I thought it was just me," and a chorus answers, "It never was." So what is modern madness, really? It is the legacy of misunderstood pain. It is the echo of centuries of silence. It is the aftermath of lives shaped by suppression, expectation, and dismissal. But it is also something else. It is the quiet revolution of women who are naming their wounds, who are rejecting shame, who are demanding care that doesn't sedate, silence, or scold, but listens, and learns, and heals. And so, in this final chapter, we do not find closure in a diagnosis. We find it in a question. What if madness was never madness at all, just unheard? Sorrow, finally speaking its name.